Oh, good morning. This morning we're going to be in all four of the Gospels at various points because we are looking at the three apostles we don't know all that much about. I might have been able to squeak one sermon out of Simon the Zealot, but rather than try that, I'm just going to put them with the other two and talk about all three of these apostles. They are talked about collectively one time. And that is in Matthew chapter 10, verses, the first few verses of that. Mark chapter 3, verses 16 through 19, and Luke chapter 6, verses 14 through 16. John 14, verse 22, then mentions one of them, and all he does is ask one question. And so we don't know all that much about any of these three. And that's all right. We don't need to know a ton about all 12 of them. But we know enough to talk about them at least a little bit. We're given a little bit to go off of with all of them. And so the verses that mention them are the verses that talk about the selecting of the 12. Matthew chapter 10, and when he had called his 12 disciples to him, he gave them the power over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease. Now these are the name of the 12 apostles are these. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, and Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Now, Mark's is essentially exactly the same as Matthew. We're just going to read off the list of the 12 from Mark, and that's 3 verses 16 through 19. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, to whom he gave Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. And they went into a house. And then Luke chapter 6 gives us a little bit more information on some of these men. It's a little bit different. Luke chapter 6, verses 14 through 16 reads, Simon, whom he also named Peter, and Andrew his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon called the Zealot, and Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Now, there is one of those names that is completely different, and so it's very easy to tell who that is. So Thaddeus is not mentioned in Luke. Instead, his name given is Judas, the son of James. He is later on in the book of John called Judas not Iscariot. He is attributed to a question. The second James that is mentioned, the son of Alphaeus, is occasionally in various Gospels called James the Lesser. And so we know something about James as well. And then Simon is called a zealot here, in case we were confused about what it meant that he was a Canaanite. Those are actually two different names for the exact same thing. It's not the region that he came from. All 12 probably grew up somewhere around the region of Canaan, but with maybe the exception of Philip. But it is instead a designation of his political party. We don't know a ton about these three men. There is some information, however, that we can use to gain a bit of understanding of who they are. But due to the nature of the fact we don't know all that much about the three of them, it is best to talk about these three together. Now, the people who put a lot more stock in some amount of tradition will have a lot more to say on these three men. But outside of the gospel, inside of the gospel, there's not too much said about these men. There is some traditions surrounding them. For instance, some people think that instead of Bartholomew being Nathaniel from the book of John, the beginning of John, some people think that might be Simon the Zealot. And they have reasons for that, and it does change the narrative around Nathaniel there a little bit, and why he responds the way he does, and why he's talked to the way he is. I think there's a lot more evidence for that being Bartholomew, personally. But some people might say that Nathaniel in John is another name for Simon. Some people will also claim some of these men are brothers of each other. James, for instance, is often pointed to as perhaps the brother of Matthew, as Matthew is at one point called the son of, or Levi, the son of Alphaeus, and James is called the son of Alphaeus. Now, they could be two different Alphaeuses. They're never really attached as brothers. And the one thing we do know for certain is that both James and Judas here are not the brothers of Jesus. That some people make a weird link to the brothers of Jesus being this James or that Judas. But that's not the case, because it is outright stated that none of Jesus' brothers believed while he was alive. So both the James and Jude that wrote the books later on, who are the brothers of Jesus, are not these ones. So we can't even turn to those books to get a good read on their personalities. But we are given quite a bit of information on them just from what is said. First of all, we know that Simon is a zealot. And now, who are the zealots? Now, historically, the zealots were a political terror group. And I'm not just throwing around the word terror. I'm not just saying that they're a terrorist and then moving on from that. They were a political terrorist group. That was their entire point. They trained themselves in assassinations. And in fact, the group's image, I believe, was often of a knife, sometimes even dripping in poison. And what they would do is they would target Roman officials that they didn't like that were in Judea, and they would send one of their group in with a knife hidden, and when they got close to the target, they would stab them and then disappear into the crowd. So they were actual terrorists. Like, that was their goal, was to terrorize the Romans that were occupying Judea. Now, most of the Israelites didn't really approve of that. They didn't like Roman rule, but you don't really want to get the Romans mad at you when they're occupying your territory. Now, they did all this in the belief that causing violence and causing a violent uprising would bring about the presence of the Messiah. That's what they believed that they were doing. That's what they believed they were speeding up. This is, of course, due to misreading, as is most such doctrinal errors. Now, by the time of Jesus, the Zealots had mostly calmed down. They still used a lot of violent rhetoric, but they weren't as heavy on the assassinations as they used to be. But they did talk an awful lot about overthrowing the Romans and removing the Romans, possibly violently, if the Romans didn't want to leave. They opposed high taxes and they despised Roman rule. Now, it's possible Simon was trained, therefore, as an assassin, which has a beautiful sort of poetic irony to it, in that Jesus took a trained killer and turned him into a man who was dedicated to saving souls. Took someone trained in taking life and turned him into a life saver. Whether Simon was a zealot in training or whether he was a zealot in political affiliation, that's not super important. He took a man who had violent tendencies and in 3 years turned him into a fisher of men. Simon, in fact, just from what we know of him in this short amount of time, just merely stating he was Simon the Zealot, and Jesus took him and turned him into an apostle. And what we know about the apostles, being that they were the ones who preached on the day of Pentecost and saved 3,000 souls, just from that alone, we know a lot about Jesus. That Jesus is able to take anyone. That Simon is proof that there is not one person that Jesus cannot change. There is no one in this world that Jesus is not able to take and turn into a fisher of men. Now, James the Lesser, or James the son of Alphaeus, he's one of the 12. This alone is a big achievement, right? The 12 were dedicated. They didn't come and go like the other disciples. They stuck with Jesus and learned at his feet for 3 years. And I don't want to make it sound like the other disciples were fickle. You sort of had 3 different groups, right? You had the 12, and they're always traveling with Jesus. You have the disciples. They're the people who believe in Jesus, but they have other jobs, right? They're not able to travel up and down the country for 3 years with Jesus. They didn't drop everything and go follow Jesus for 3 years. That's the 12's job. The disciples listen to Jesus. They appreciate his teachings. They put it into practice, and they go and they spread his word by going into their communities. Right? It's an important job. It's just not the 12. It's not the same as being there for 3 years, constantly, every night, listening to Jesus. And then there's the multitude. And the multitude aren't serious disciples of Jesus, right? They're following Jesus for the miracles, for the free food, for whatever it is that they might be able to see. That's sort of your 3 groups. And so you have the people who seriously appreciate Jesus and his message and want to listen and want to grow and want to have a relationship with God. But then there's the 12, and James the Lesser is part of that. And it's a big achievement. And they stick with Jesus. They learn at his feet for 3 years. I went to preaching school for 2 years, essentially, and dedicated my life to just sitting and studying the Word of God for 2 years. And, I've studied after that as well. But it is different When all you're doing every day is studying the Word of God, that's a huge commitment. And they did it for 3 years. And not only did they do it for 3 years, they did it at the feet of the man who literally knows everything there is to know about the Bible. Now, I can't say that for any of my teachers at the School of Preaching. Right? They certainly know a lot. A lot of them had 20, 40 years of preaching under their belt, some of them 60 years. They certainly knew a lot, but it's much different when it's Jesus teaching you. You get to pick the brain of the guy who wrote the book, essentially, and put all of the nuance in there. The name the lesser. Well, he's the younger of the two James, so that's something that's interesting. It's also often thought that James and John, the two fishermen, were rather young compared to most of the other apostles. In fact, James is sometimes thought to have been as young as 15 when he was called, depending on who you ask. And so if John, the brother of James, is that young, that would put James at fairly young too. And if then we have another James the Lesser, it's possible James the Lesser is somewhere around 18, 19, 20. Fairly young, especially to be going around the countryside with Jesus, listening at his feet day in and day out. But you'll notice, by no means did that make him less useful to the kingdom. In fact, when you take the Bible as a whole, when you start at the beginning, go all the way through it, and you look at the ages of the people who are talked about, and the ages of men of faith, and people who accomplish great things for God, you'll notice that age has nothing whatsoever to do with how useful they might be. We're going through the book of Exodus at the moment. How old is Moses during most of the book of Exodus? He's 80. Moses is 80 years old when he goes and stands before Pharaoh and speaks for God, and God uses him to bring about the 10 plagues in Egypt. He's 80 years old. God has every bit of use for him as he would have if he had sent him when he was 40 or 20. David is a youth of 18, 19 when he is used by God to strike down Goliath. And then David is 40 when he becomes king over Israel. Age has no part in how useful you are to God. We can keep going with examples. Abraham, he's 80 when he's sent from God from his homeland and sent over to Canaan. Thomas, he's a youth when he starts. I'm talking about the Thomas that works with Paul, but right. That Thomas is a youth, probably just coming out of adolescence when he starts working with Paul, and Paul works him up into this great worker in the kingdom. If John's 15 when he's called by Christ off the boat, that's a 15-year-old that Jesus calls and says, "Come with me and I'll make you a fisher of men." And that would make him about 18. When Christ is crucified and Jesus says, "Woman, behold your son." We've been working our way through the book of Proverbs, which, by the way, we have a proverb sermon tonight. And this is something that's very important and is stressed throughout the book of Proverbs. Youth spent wisely is one of the most precious assets you can ever have. And when I say youth spent wisely, and when I say that the worst thing you can do with time is waste it, I don't necessarily mean wasting it on entertainment. Obviously, it's a problem if all you do is entertain yourself endlessly. If all you do is play video games, then you're probably wasting your life. But that's not really the sort of waste I'm talking about. That might be foolish. But what I'm really talking about is wasting your life in sin and on sin is the worst thing you can do. And what the Bible advocates for is not wasting your time with sin, but spending your time with God, spending your time on God. And that's the greatest thing you can spend your youth on. I've sort of bashed on them a little bit before, but I'll bring it up again. The Amish have this tradition of going and sowing their wild oats, and I have no idea where they got that from, because the Bible repeatedly says again and again, don't do that. It doesn't really help you in the long run to go and experience worldly pleasures. Instead, what is most valuable is spending your time with God. Now, are there things that you can do if you have spent time in sin? Yes. In fact, you can use yourself as a negative example for young people. Don't do what I did. Here's what it's done to me. But it's much greater for yourself if you can learn wisdom from other people's mistakes. And as we just covered in Simon, God can still use anybody. And we're going to talk about it in a couple of weeks when we get to Paul or Saul. But how valuable it is for young people, James or John, or any youth who finds themselves in the position to serve God from a very early age, to make that choice. And then, of course, we have Thaddeus or Judas. We find that his surname is Thaddeus, so I guess it's Judas Thaddeus. And there was a third name given for him, too. We'll just use these two. Now, he's not the Lord's brother, as I've already covered. You know, his brothers did not yet believe when he was alive. They believed at his resurrection. But this Judas did believe. He's the son of James. And you sort of almost get the idea that he's sort of an everyman. He's a common man. He's proof that God can use anyone, anywhere, however insignificant you may think yourself. Right? We've got the fishermen, but they're all real close friends with Jesus. And so some people may think, oh yeah, sure, they were common, but Jesus made them uncommon by being close friends with them. Well, here's Judas, the son of James. And what do we know about Judas, the son of James? Well, we know next to nothing. He's got one of the most common names, one of the most common names for his father. And yet he's proof that God can use anyone, anywhere. We find that Thaddeus is not afraid to admit when he doesn't understand things. And that's John chapter 14, verse 22. Judas, not Iscariot, said to him, Lord, how is it that you will manifest yourself to us and not to the world? So it might at first appear that he's a rather common man, but we find that he's got some uncommon traits. He's not afraid to admit his ignorance on subjects. And that's a powerful ability. There's plenty of people who are afraid to admit when they don't know something. He's not afraid to admit he didn't understand. And he then pointedly asks Christ what he means when he's talking about something. Can you explain this to me? And it's a very useful skill. It's a very useful skill. It can bring about much learning, much understanding. What we learn from this Judas is don't fear ignorance, fear remaining ignorant. Sometimes we get a little bit irritated at 30-year-olds for repeatedly asking the question, why? But it's a powerful question when it's used properly. And really the reason that we're getting upset at them for asking why is they're just sort of saying it to say it. And at a certain point you know it. But when you use that question properly, well, why is this? That's a powerful question. One of the things we're going to try to do as we're going through the book of Exodus, and I encourage you to, if you haven't been attending the Bible class, to come join us for this Bible class, is when we get to the bits of Exodus that we begin to go through the law. A lot of people feel like that's slow and that's boring and that we just got to get through it. We're going to start asking ourselves the question of why. Well, why is this a law? Why did God decide that this needed to be a law in Israel? Why does their nation work the way that it works if they had followed the law? Because that's one of the other things that we're going to do, is we're going to talk about they never actually followed the law that God had given them. And so we'll ask ourselves the question also of what is going on there. What would have happened if they had followed the law? But this morning, as we turn our attention back to these three men, Simon the Zealot, James the Lesser, Thaddeus or Judas, you can find all sorts of information of people making up whatever they want to about these people. There will be people who tell you that all three of these men are brothers, and also they're brothers with Matthew. You can find people saying that all three of these men are brothers, and they're brothers with Thomas, the doubter. Some would tell you one thing and others another thing. But one thing is most definitely for certain. These are all three incredible men of faith, chosen for a reason. And we can clearly see at least one of the reasons that they're chosen in that, in the end, after Christ had resurrected, after they had seen the risen Lord and seen him ascend, because all 12 of these men saw him go up into the sky, not one recanted on their belief that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, sent from heaven, from the Father, to live, to die, to be raised again. So regardless of how much we know about each one of these men personally, we can know for certain that their faith was what set them apart. They were, all of them, willing to die for the resurrected Christ. If there's anyone here who needs to respond to an invitation to be as sure about your faith as these men, if you need to commit your life to Christ this morning, there stands an invitation to put on Christ, to be baptized, not just sprinkled into the body, but buried into the body of Christ. Plunge so deeply into Christ that his blood will cleanse your sins. Not just now, but as long as you are faithful until the very end. If there's anyone here who needs to respond to that invitation, I urge you to come forward as we stand and sing our invitation song.